President Biden's offering a new lifeline for certain small businesses who are struggling to survive the pandemic. He says he's changing a government loan programme in order to help more minority-owned and very small businesses get funding. He was at a White House event. He said lawmakers must also do their part.
We need Congress to pass my American Rescue Plan. It deals with the immediate crisis facing our small businesses. Now, critics say the plan is too big. Let me ask them a rhetorical question. What would you have me cut? What would you leave out? The American Rescue Plan targets $50 billion to support the hardest-hit small businesses after this program expires at the end of March. Would you not help invest in them? Would you let them continue to go under?
Paul Krugman is the Nobel Prize-winning economist and opinion columnist for the New York Times. Paul, how good to see you, sir. I hope you're well. And family, thank you for joining us. I read your articles, and I know that the view on this stimulus package, that it is too much. As the president says, what do you have them cut? But we now have critics on both sides of the Atlantic who say that some in Europe say the European Commission's plans are too much. Now they say that the US 1.9 trillion is too much. What are they seeing that others are not?
Oh, first of all, this is after the past 4 years, this is a totally surreal debate. You actually have intelligent, well-informed, honest people on both sides, and I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around that. And so there are people like Larry Summers, Olivier Blanchard here who are saying, "Oh, this is too big." And then there's people like Goldman Sachs and the IMF, and of course me and Janet Yellen, saying no, it isn't too big. I think the point is that if we think of this purely as a stimulus plan, and you imagine that if there's a whole bunch of things that if you think you could believe in, then you might say, well, maybe we should have something smaller. If you believe the Congressional Budget Office, which doesn't think the economy is in that deep a hole, then it looks like a pretty big plan given that. But that's a highly contentious view. And I'm on the side of the people who think that the hole is a lot deeper than the CBO numbers say. If you believe that we could come back for more if this turns out to be insufficient, then you might say, well, why don't we do something smaller and see? But the lesson we learned from 2009 is that that's not how it works. If this thing isn't a clear success right out the gate, then we will not get a second chance. And then there's the balance of risks. If the plan ends up, no one really knows the numbers. I would make a pretty strong case that this plan is about the right size, but of course I could be wrong. But the balance of risks, if it turns out to be too big, well, the Fed can rein it in. We're not going to have an explosion of inflation. If it turns out to be too small, then we're really in big trouble.
This idea of no inflation, there is no inflation at the moment. There is unlikely to be any inflation. But still, the inflation bogeymen are there, warning that there is, that you're tinkering with the tinder of a fire.
Yeah, I mean, there is something weird about the way that the 1970s is still dominating people's nightmares when it's a really long time ago, and a lot of terrible things that had nothing to do with inflation have happened since then. Let's put it this way: if you work at it hard enough, if we were going to spend 20% of GDP on debt-financed government spending, even I would say, oh, that's inflationary. But the question is, given where we are, given that we now have a long history of stable prices, the idea that we're going to break out into a runaway wage price spiral, just all overnight, just doesn't make sense.
I want to talk about electricity, if I may, and Texas.
Yeah.
Because here we have a fascinating real-life case of deregulation a few decades ago with unforeseen consequences today. What do you make of that as a free marketeer at the same time looking for sensible regulation? What did they get wrong in Texas?
Oh, It's not necessarily, there is a role possibly for markets. There's something to be said for allowing multiple generators to compete to supply electricity to the grid. So it's not that we have to have a government monopoly or that we have to necessarily have the tightly regulated utility system of the past. But what the Texans did not do is they did not do prudential regulation. They did not say you have to have some reserve capacity. They did not say you have to make your capacity robust. There was nothing at all in there saying, what about winterizing? And it's not because deep freezes never happened. They had a smaller but similar episode in 2011. They had another episode about a dozen years before that. So they took no precautions. They said, "Oh, the magic of the marketplace will solve the problem." And guess what? It doesn't. And when the nightmare hits, suddenly you have Ted Cruz saying the regulators need to step in there and stop the profiteering. And if a system is leading Ted Cruz to say, "Oh, profiteering is bad and we need price controls," then you really know that you've messed things up really badly.
I continue to be worried, Paul, about Bitcoin, which is pulling back from a record high. It's now down. It's sort of past 58,000 at one point, and it's now down 6%. It's whatever. Digital wallets. I mean, the whole thing with Bitcoin, and then we had GameStop and all of these and the Reddit. I get the feeling that there's something wild happening in markets that is unsavory and going to end badly.
Well, GameStop was tiny when all is said and done. This was a little blip, and there are lots of things that happen. Bitcoin is not. Bitcoin is a huge thing. The weird thing about Bitcoin is it's been around for a dozen years now, and still nobody has actually found any real use for it. We're not actually using blockchain for any significant amount of economic activity. In a way, as some people have said, the reason that Bitcoin is still chugging along, whereas GameStop stopped, is that GameStop has the big problem that there's a real business underlying it. And people could look at the real business and say, well, that's not worth it. And Bitcoin, there is no real business. There's actually pretty much no real use. And so it's completely untethered to reality. And it is whatever people think it should be worth. I've given up entirely on trying to figure out where it's going to go.
A good note for us to say, Paul Krugman. Thank you, sir. I appreciate your time tonight. I appreciate it. Thank you. Paul Krugman joined me.